Kenya's President William Ruto has told police to shoot looters and arsonists in the leg. He's ordered officers to curb the ongoing anti-government protests that have seen some of the country's worst violence in years. Dozens have been killed in nationwide clashes between police and demonstrators. Weeks of protests were sparked by outrage over the death of a popular blogger who was in police custody. Tensions escalated further after a police officer was filmed fatally shooting a civilian at close range during a protest against police brutality. Ruto now says authorities should take a hard line against those he blames for the violence.
There are people who think they can sponsor violence in Kenya. They burnt properties the other day, looted supermarkets, destroyed people's properties, destroyed people's businesses. And there are leaders who are inciting these things, paying young people to go and burn people's businesses. Anyone going to set ablaze anyone's business and property, such a person should be shot in the leg, be taken to hospital and taken to court. They should not kill him, but break the leg so that they can go to the hospital and courts afterwards.
There's a stark message there. We're going to talk about that. I'm joined now by Nanyala Nyanola, a Kenyan author and political analyst. She is in Edinburgh, Scotland tonight. It's good to have you on the program. We just heard President Ruto there. What do you make of the government's response to these protests?
I think that it was a very ill-advised statement. I think it's very important to pay attention to the fact that it was a statement that was made in Kiswahili and not in English, which is the second official language of the country. And that is really an attempt to speak directly to Kenyans in a language that he doesn't believe that people will understand outside the immediate context and will hold him accountable for. This is a very dangerous escalation. It is a call for police brutality, which is the very thing that people have been out in the streets protesting. So if I could, let me just pick up on the point about the language thing. So you think that the president used the language to circumvent public criticism? I mean, is he trying to hide what he's saying? International criticism. I think it's a political choice that a lot of senior Kenyan politicians make when they want to separate themselves from international scrutiny. Keep in mind that Ruto was just in Europe earlier this week. He was in France, where he met with President Macron, and he was in the UK. And this is a very huge departure from the rhetoric that he was using when he was speaking to the leaders of these countries. So there's an element there of trying to separate himself from accountability, from his comments, from visibility for the things that he's saying, from international scrutiny, if you will, for the things that he's saying. And in this particular case, this is a very significant escalation against peaceful protesters, because what he's calling for really is police brutality.
The president has warned of regime change. How much potential is there for these protests to morph into a coup? What do you think?
I think it's very difficult for a leaderless movement to get to the point where it can pose threat to an elected government. I think that's just a universal truth. This is a leaderless movement, a wave of discontent that has arisen from very specific socioeconomic and political conditions. The most significant escalating factor that we've seen, and this is a cycle of protest that really goes back to last year in the anti-finance bill protests, is first of all an intolerance for dissent, an intolerance for listening and using the established constitutional mechanisms for listening to the people, whether that is ignoring submissions that are made in Parliament, ignoring submissions that are made to the legislature, and then ignoring what protests are calling for. So I think this is a leaderless movement that is arising out of a very specific moment and is not really looking for regime change, but is looking to be heard by an executive that, on the other hand, is making it clear that they have no interest in listening to what the people have to say, that has forced through unpopular fiscal measures, that has forced through unpopular political measures, that continues to use disproportionate force against peaceful protesters and against young people specifically, who were the constituency that Ruto courted when he was running for office. So he made promises to these young people that he would offer a broad-based and inclusive government. And it is that frustration and that disappointment that is leading to these cycles of calls for protests and calls for people to go out and march. And so I think that there's a deliberate effort here to mischaracterize what's happening in the country in order to justify the disproportionate use of force. Really, if there was just allowed people to protest peacefully and allowed for the constitutional mechanisms for public participation, for engaging the legislative process to run as they were designed constitutionally, you wouldn't see this particular push. I
want to let our viewers know, too, back in 2018, you published a book entitled Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. And that brings us to the constituencies you were talking about, young people in Kenya. What role does the internet, social media, what role do they play in these protests?
I think it's been a space where people are able to speak to each other directly and are able to circumvent some of the sort of strictures that exist within traditional media, which is legacy media in Kenya is owned by political families and has shown historically bias. Censorship is very common. We saw, for example, during this last round of protests that despite constitutional and measures that prohibited this and despite the intervention of the courts, the government did impose a temporary shutdown on broadcasts because they didn't want people to broadcast what was happening in the protests. So I think what social media does is allows people to find each other, and it allows people to speak to each other directly outside of these constraints that exist within the legacy media. I think it also allows for people to speak to each other creatively. And this was one of the really interesting things that emerged out of the June 25th protests from last year, was that completely unprompted and completely unorganized, these young people translated the provisions of the finance bill into multiple local languages, disseminated this on various social media platforms, and that became a form of civic engagement and a form of civic education that just wasn't possible with any of the institutional civil society groups that exist. And these are the kind of things that social media makes possible. It's obviously complicated by the fact that these platforms are owned by American, mostly by American companies. And so now in this moment that these platforms are having with the American political space, that also brings complications for Kenyan users.
Nyala and Yanola, we appreciate your time. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.